You are standing on a low, dusty hilltop in the far southeast of Turkey, on a plateau where the wind never really stops moving. Around you, half sunk in pale limestone rubble, a ring of massive T-shaped pillars rises out of the ground, some taller than you, a few taller than a two-story house, each one carved from a single block of stone that would have taken dozens of people working together to drag, raise, and set upright. Foxes chase each other around the base of one pillar. A vulture spreads its wings across the face of another, wings and talons rendered with a precision that should not, by any reasonable account of human history, exist yet. Two much larger pillars stand at the center of the ring, facing each other like a pair of figures caught mid-conversation, and if you look closely at their sides, you can make out something unmistakably human, a stone forearm bent at the elbow, long fingers carved in relief, resting where a waist would be, above a belt and a loincloth carved directly into the rock. Someone built this. And when radiocarbon dating first came back on the site in the 1990s, it delivered a number that archaeologists initially found difficult to simply accept, roughly 11,600 years old. Older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids of Giza by around 7,000. Older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than any known system of writing anywhere on Earth, and, according to the accepted timeline of human history at the time it was found, older than agriculture itself, built not by settled farmers with surplus grain and organized kingdoms, but by hunter-gatherers who had, as far as anyone could tell, no business building anything even remotely like this. This place is called Göbekli Tepe, a modern Turkish name that translates, without much ceremony, to Potbelly Hill, a reference to the gentle, rounded rise of the mound itself, long before anyone suspected what was buried inside it. For most of the 20th century, it was exactly that, an unremarkable hill outside the city of Sanliurfa, grazed by local sheep, its true contents hidden less than a meter beneath the surface. And the story of how it was found, twice, with 3 full decades of silence in between, turns out to be almost as strange as what it eventually revealed. The first time anyone with a trained archaeological eye looked closely at Göbekli Tepe was in 1963, when a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University was cataloging prehistoric sites across the region. They noted the hill, recorded a scatter of broken limestone slabs poking up through the soil, correctly guessed that people had once used the place for something, and then, reasonably enough, given what stone slabs on a hilltop usually mean in that part of the world, concluded it was probably an abandoned medieval cemetery, unremarkable by the standards of a region absolutely saturated with ancient sites. They moved on. Their notes sat quietly in an archive for over 30 years, one line among thousands, describing what may be the single most important archaeological discovery of the last century as though it were a footnote not worth a second visit. The second look came in 1994, and it came from a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had spent years excavating a nearby Neolithic site called Navali Kori, a settlement that has since been submerged beneath a reservoir created by a dam, but which, before it disappeared underwater, had already produced its own T-shaped stone pillars, carved with animals and human features in a style nobody had seen documented in this exact combination anywhere else. Schmidt was, by his own later account, specifically looking for other sites that might share that same unusual architectural signature when he came across the old 1963 survey notes describing the broken slabs at Göbekli Tepe. He recognized immediately what the earlier team had missed. These were not cemetery markers. He drove out to the site, walked the hill himself, and reportedly knew within minutes of arriving that he had found something extraordinary, not a medieval graveyard, but pillars in the same unmistakable T-shape he had spent years excavating at Navali Kori, only far larger, far more numerous, and, once excavation began the following year, dramatically older than anything he or almost anyone else in his field had previously imagined possible for organized monumental construction. What Schmidt's team began uncovering, layer by careful layer, over the 2 decades of excavation that followed, was not one building but a whole landscape of them, a series of large circular and oval enclosures, each ringed by a set of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some measuring over 5 meters tall and weighing upward of 10 tons, set into low stone walls, with 2 even larger pillars standing free at the center of each ring. The enclosures were given plain working labels, enclosure A, B, C, D, and so on as more were identified, and enclosure D, one of the best preserved, has become something close to the public face of the entire site, a nearly complete stone circle, its central pair of pillars facing one another with those unmistakable carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloths, strongly suggesting that the pillars themselves were never meant to represent abstract markers or simple architectural supports, but stylized figures, ancestors, deities, or spirits, nobody can say for certain which, standing permanently at the center of whatever took place inside that ring. The carvings covering the rest of the pillars form one of the richest bodies of prehistoric imagery ever found in a single location: foxes in mid-stride, wild boars with raised bristles, coiling snakes, scorpions with segmented tails rendered in careful relief, cranes and other wading birds, aurochs, the massive wild ancestor of modern cattle, and, on several pillars, vultures with wings spread wide, a bird whose recurring, prominent presence across the site has become one of the most debated details in the entire excavation. None of this was crude. The carving is confident, deliberate, and in places genuinely skillful, produced using nothing but stone tools, by people who, according to every other line of archaeological evidence recovered from the site, had not yet domesticated a single plant or animal, had not yet built permanent houses in the way that word is usually understood, and were, by the conventional and until then largely unquestioned model of human prehistory, simply not supposed to be capable of large-scale, coordinated, monumental construction at all. That contradiction sits at the very center of why Göbekli Tepe matters, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it genuinely inverted a piece of the story humanity had been telling itself about itself for well over a century. The traditional model of the Neolithic revolution ran, more or less, like this: humans settle down, humans domesticate wheat and barley and sheep and goats, humans generate a reliable food surplus for the first time, and only once that surplus exists, once people are no longer spending every waking hour simply finding enough to eat, do they finally have the spare time, the spare labor, and the social organization necessary to build monuments, develop religion in any organized architectural sense, and lay the groundwork for what would eventually become cities. Farming first, monuments and religion later. It was a tidy, materially logical sequence, and it fit the evidence reasonably well for a long time. Göbekli Tepe, dated with increasing confidence to somewhere around 9600 to 800 BCE, squarely within the period archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, meaning before pottery, and in its earliest and largest phases, apparently before full-scale farming as well, appeared to run that entire sequence backward. Just how seriously the builders took this project becomes even clearer if you walk a short distance from the enclosures themselves, out to the limestone bedrock where the pillars were originally quarried. Lying there still, half-carved and never fully freed from the surrounding rock, is a single unfinished pillar that would have dwarfed every other one raised at the site, estimated by the excavation team at somewhere around 50 tons, roughly 5 times the weight of the largest pillars actually standing in the enclosures. Something stopped the work before it was finished, a crack discovered partway through the carving, a shift in plans, a simple failure of the available labor and rope and timber to move a stone that size any further, nobody can say for certain which. But its presence tells you something the finished pillars alone cannot. The people working this hillside were not modestly testing the limits of what stone tool technology and coordinated human muscle could achieve. They were pushing against those limits directly, in full view of anyone walking past the quarry, and in at least this one case, the stone itself won. Klaus Schmidt's own interpretation, which he continued refining until his death in 2014, became one of the most influential and most argued over ideas in modern archaeology. Not, first came farming, then came the temple, but very possibly the reverse. First came the temple, and the temple is what helped produce the farming. His reasoning went roughly like this. Building and maintaining a site like Göbekli Tepe, quarrying multi-ton limestone pillars from a nearby bedrock outcrop, carving them, dragging them, in some cases several hundred meters, and raising them upright into precisely engineered rings, and doing this not once but repeatedly, across generations, required something that hunter-gatherer bands, by definition scattered and mobile in small family groups, do not normally have, the ability to gather large numbers of people in one place, at the same time, for extended periods, and feed every one of them while they worked. Excavators found enormous quantities of animal bone at the site, wild gazelle in particular, along with aurochs and other game, consistent with large-scale feasting events, gatherings that would have brought dispersed hunter-gatherer groups together from a wide surrounding region, likely for shared ritual purposes centered on the pillars themselves. And feeding that many people, that reliably, over that many repeated gatherings, is precisely the kind of sustained pressure that could plausibly push a population toward experimenting with managing wild grain more intensively, watching it, protecting it, eventually planting it on purpose, not because anyone had decided in the abstract to invent farming, but because a recurring religious or ceremonial obligation to feed a crowd created a very practical incentive to secure the food supply in advance. It is worth noting, as a striking supporting detail, that genetic studies of modern domesticated wheat have traced its closest wild ancestor to the slopes of the Karahan mountain range, which sits remarkably close to Göbekli Tepe itself, within the same general region where this theory suggests the earliest steps toward deliberate cultivation may have first taken hold. Feeding those gathered crowds, some researchers have argued, may not have meant only roasted gazelle and aurochs. In 2012, a study led by Oliver Dietrich and colleagues examined a set of large limestone troughs recovered from the site, some capable of holding well over 150 liters, and found chemical residues consistent with oxalate, a compound that forms during the steeping and fermenting of cereal grain, the same basic chemistry behind the earliest known beer. The interpretation remains debated rather than settled, and nobody is claiming these Neolithic gatherings resembled a modern brewery, but the possibility that the crowds drawn to Göbekli Tepe were sharing a fermented grain drink alongside their feasts of wild meat adds a genuinely human, almost startlingly familiar texture to a scene that can otherwise feel impossibly remote. Strangers converging on a hilltop from miles around, sharing food, sharing drink, and raising stone in honor of something they believed was worth all of it. If a story like this one, a monument that quietly rewrites the order in which humans invented religion and invented farming, buried under a hill for 11,500 years before anyone thought to look twice, is the kind of thing that keeps you turning pages, or keeps you up scrolling for just one more article at midnight, this channel is built for exactly that feeling. New episodes on lost cities, vanished civilizations, and unsolved archaeological mysteries go up regularly, and if you would like more evenings spent drifting through stories like this one, this is a good moment to hit subscribe before we go further into the stones. Not every archaeologist has been fully convinced by the farming followed religion version of the story, and it's worth being honest about where the debate currently stands rather than presenting Schmidt's original framing as a settled conclusion. For years, the dominant picture of Göbekli Tepe was of a purely ceremonial site with no permanent residents at all, no ordinary houses, no domestic hearths, no daily life debris of the kind you would expect from people actually living there full time, which fit neatly with the idea of scattered hunter-gatherer bands traveling in periodically for ritual gatherings and then dispersing again. But more recent excavation seasons have complicated that picture considerably. During the 2025 excavation season, led by archaeologist Nick Carroll, teams working in a newly opened area north of the site's protected monumental core uncovered a cluster of rectangular structures that looked distinctly more domestic in character than anything found near the great stone rings themselves, alongside grinding stones, flint sickle blades, and traces of processed plant material, the kind of everyday material culture associated with people staying somewhere long enough to prepare and store food, not simply passing through for a festival. It does not overturn the core insight that monumental, large-scale construction here predates full agricultural domestication by a meaningful stretch of time. But it does suggest that truth may be less a clean binary, pure ritual center versus ordinary village, and more a genuinely blurred, transitional kind of settlement, exactly the sort of messy, in-between reality you would actually expect to find at the hinge point of one of the largest transformations in human history, rather than the sort of tidy story that makes for an easy textbook diagram. That same 2025 season produced another discovery that made international headlines on its own, a life-size human statue, with a clearly rendered head and torso, unearthed in the space between two of the site's enclosures, labeled B and D. It marked the first time a sculpture of this specific, fully human type had been recovered at Göbekli Tepe itself, even though broadly similar carved figures had already turned up at related sites nearby, which is itself a clue worth holding on to, because Göbekli Tepe, it turns out, was never quite as alone on its hilltop as the first decades of excavation made it appear. Before we get to that wider picture, though, there is one single carved stone at Göbekli Tepe that has generated more speculation, more argument, and considerably more attention on the internet than perhaps any other object recovered from the site, Pillar 43, more commonly known by its nickname, the Vulture Stone. Carved along one narrow face of a T-shaped pillar inside enclosure C, it shows a densely packed scene, a vulture with one wing extended, positioned directly above what appears to be a small circular disc, a scorpion below it, a headless human figure, legs visible but the torso ending abruptly where the head should be, and several other animals worked into the same crowded composition, including what some researchers have read as a wild boar and a snake. In 2017, two researchers, Martin Sweatman and Demetrius Tsakritsis, published a paper arguing that the animals on Pillar 43 function as astronomical symbols, each one representing a constellation, and that the entire composition encodes a specific date, one they linked to a period of catastrophic climate disruption around 10,950 BCE, sometimes called the Younger Dryas, possibly triggered by a comet impact or fragmentation event. It is a genuinely striking, headline-friendly interpretation, and it has circulated widely in documentaries and online discussion ever since. It is also, it has to be said plainly, not an interpretation that most working archaeologists in the field accept. The core criticism is a familiar one in any field that deals with sparse, ambiguous symbolic evidence from societies who left no written explanation of their own imagery. A sufficiently motivated, retrospective reading can find a constellation-shaped pattern in almost any sufficiently rich and complex carving, And without an independent way to confirm that pre-pottery Neolithic communities in southeastern Anatolia actually organized the night sky into the specific constellation groupings, the theory assumes, the argument becomes very difficult to test or falsify in any rigorous sense. Most Göbekli Tepe specialists read the headless figure and the surrounding animals instead within a different, better supported framework, one connected not to a single ancient comet, but to a practice much closer to home, and considerably stranger in its own right, how these communities appear to have treated the human dead. That practice comes into focus through a discovery made not in the carvings themselves, but in the ground beneath them. In 2017, a research team led by Julia Gresky published an analysis of human skull fragments recovered from Göbekli Tepe, 3 separate pieces, each showing deliberate, carefully carved grooves running along the bone, and one of them featuring a drilled hole positioned in a way that strongly suggests it was meant for suspension, perhaps hung on display, perhaps carried, perhaps set into a niche where it could be seen by anyone entering the enclosure. This is not, on its own, an isolated or uniquely strange finding within the broader Neolithic Near East, the practice of specially treating, displaying, or plastering human skulls after death, sometimes called a skull cult by archaeologists, is documented at other sites of similar antiquity across the region, most famously the plastered skulls of Neolithic Jericho, found with modeled facial features rebuilt in plaster over the actual bone. What made the Göbekli Tepe skulls significant was confirmation that this same unusual mortuary practice, separating skulls from bodies, carving them, and apparently keeping them, displaying them, or otherwise treating them as objects of continued ritual attention long after death, extended into precisely the community responsible for building and using the great stone enclosures on the hill. The headless figure carved into the Vulture Stone, in this reading, is not primarily an astronomical marker. It is very possibly a depiction of exactly this practice, a carved reminder, standing permanently in stone, of a funerary custom the builders themselves lived, and died, inside. Recent work at a related site has only deepened this picture. Excavations at Karahan Tepe, a sister site roughly 35 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, and one of the most important discoveries to emerge from the broader region in the last several years, have documented their own dramatic evidence of skull-focused ritual, a square wall niche found holding a human skull, alongside separate analysis identifying deliberate skull separation, careful cut marks consistent with intentional defleshing, and, in some cases, evidence that the bone had been deliberately exposed to controlled fire as part of whatever ritual sequence was being performed. Karahan Tepe itself has, over a remarkably short span of active excavation, turned out to be no minor footnote to Göbekli Tepe but something close to a rival in scale and ambition. Researchers have now documented close to 250 T-shaped pillars across the site, along with a series of full-bodied human statues, including one recovered in 2023 and a second announced in 2025, both showing carefully rendered hands positioned near the lower torso, a gesture repeated across multiple carved figures at the site in a way that suggests it carried specific, shared meaning for the people who made them, even though nobody today can say with confidence exactly what that meaning was. Karahan Tepe is not an isolated exception either. It belongs to a rapidly expanding constellation of related sites now grouped together under a coordinated Turkish government excavation and research initiative called the Taz Tepler Project, Stone Hills, in English, launched to systematically investigate a cluster of at least a dozen related locations scattered across a roughly 200-kilometer stretch of southeastern Anatolia, all sharing broadly the same era, the same T-shaped pillar tradition, and, increasingly, the same repertoire of carved animals, human figures, and ritual practices. One of the most striking finds from this wider network came from a site called Seeberg, where excavators uncovered a carved relief panel depicting what many archaeologists consider the oldest known narrative scene in the world, a human figure positioned between a wild bull and what appears to be a pair of leopards, arranged not as isolated symbolic animals scattered across a surface, but as a single unfolding composition, a story told in stone rather than merely a set of individually meaningful images. Taken together, Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Seeberg, Navali Kori, and the other sites now under active investigation across this region no longer look like a single isolated architectural miracle standing alone in an otherwise ordinary prehistoric landscape. They look like the visible remains of an entire interconnected ritual world, spread across many communities, sustained over a genuinely long span of centuries, developed by populations who were, by any fair reading of the evidence, considerably more organized, more symbolically sophisticated, and more capable of sustained collective effort than the label, hunter-gatherer, has traditionally been allowed to suggest. And yet, for all of that sophistication, for all the labor invested in quarrying, carving, and raising these pillars, the story of Göbekli Tepe does not end with a slow fade into ordinary abandonment, the kind of gradual emptying out you might expect from a site people simply stopped visiting over a few forgettable generations. It ends, instead, with an act that is at least as strange as anything carved into the stones themselves. The site was deliberately, systematically buried by the very people who built it. Sometime around 8000 BCE, after centuries of active use, the great early enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, including the large, elaborately carved rings like Enclosure D, were filled in on purpose, packed with a dense mixture of rubble, broken flint tools, and animal bone, not with the gradual accumulation of wind-blown dust and collapsed roofing you would expect from simple neglect, but with material that appears to have been deliberately transported and placed. This backfilling is, in a strange twist of archaeological fortune, precisely why the site survived in such remarkable condition for 11,500 years in the first place, sealed away from erosion, exposure, and later disturbance almost immediately after it went out of active use, an accidental preservation act performed, ironically, by an act of intentional closure. But the burial also raises a question that nobody has yet fully answered. Why would a community go to the considerable additional effort of filling in a monument they had already invested so much labor into building? The pattern gets stranger still once you look closely at the sequence of construction across the site's history rather than treating it as a single unchanging moment frozen in time. The largest, most elaborately carved enclosures, Enclosure D chief among them, appear to belong to the earliest identified phase of construction, while later enclosures, built and used across subsequent generations, tend to be noticeably smaller, simpler, and less finely worked, using thinner pillars and cruder carving technique. Researchers studying this sequence, notably Oliver Dietrich and colleagues working on the site's chronology, have proposed that this progressive shrinking reflects something real happening within the society itself over time, perhaps a gradual decline in the scale of labor a community could reliably mobilize for these projects, perhaps a genuine shift in belief or ritual practice that simply required smaller, less monumental structures, perhaps early signs of the very same social transformation that, elsewhere in the region, was beginning to pull people away from mobile foraging and toward the more settled, agriculturally anchored lifestyle that would eventually define the rest of the Neolithic. Whatever drove it, the trajectory across the centuries at Göbekli Tepe runs in a direction that quietly undercuts any simple story of steady, uninterrupted progress, greater ambition and grander construction near the beginning, followed by contraction, simplification, and finally, deliberate closure, rather than triumphant expansion towards something even larger. It's worth being honest, at this point, about how much interest a site like Göbekli Tepe attracts from outside conventional archaeology entirely, a cottage industry of documentaries, books, and online theories treating it as proof of a vanished, technologically advanced global civilization predating and somehow seeding all of recorded history, Atlantis-adjacent claims that borrow the site's genuine, startling antiquity and dress it up as evidence for something considerably more extraordinary than what the excavation itself actually supports. The real, peer-reviewed picture is, if anything, more interesting than the fringe version, not less, not a lost super-civilization with knowledge it later forgot, but ordinary Stone Age hunter-gatherers, working with nothing but stone tools, muscle, and coordinated social effort, achieving something genuinely unprecedented for their technological level, then apparently choosing, deliberately and with real ceremony, to bury it and, eventually, to leave. Klaus Schmidt did not live to see most of what has come after his own initial discovery. He died in 2014, more than a decade before the domestic structures uncovered north of the core site in 2025, more than a decade before the second full-bodied statue at Karahan Tepe, before the skull cult evidence from that same neighboring site was published, before the Taz Tepler project formally coordinated what had once looked like a single anomalous hilltop into an entire visible network of related communities stretching across the region. He spent nearly 2 decades of his working life convinced that this hill held something that would meaningfully change how humanity understood its own deepest past, and by any fair measure, he was right, though the exact shape of that change keeps shifting, season after season, as more of the region gets carefully, slowly excavated, and as sites once assumed to be silent and isolated keep turning out to have neighbors nobody had looked for yet. We still do not know, with any real confidence, what words or names the builders of Göbekli Tepe gave to the figures carved into those central pillars, or what was actually said, sung, or performed inside the rings during whatever ceremonies once filled them with people and firelight. We do not know exactly why the vulture recurs so often across the carvings, or what relationship, if any, truly connects that bird to the carved and drilled human skulls found nearby. We do not know, with certainty, why a community that had already invested so many years of collective labor into these enclosures ultimately chose to fill them back in with their own hands rather than simply walking away and letting time do the work instead. What we do know is that the ground in this stretch of southeastern Turkey has, so far, refused to stop producing answers to questions nobody had thought to ask a decade earlier, a new statue turning up between 2 enclosures, a domestic structure appearing where only ritual space was assumed to exist, a niche holding a skull 35 kilometers away that quietly reframes a carving everyone thought they already understood. Somewhere under the remaining unexcavated slopes of Göbekli Tepe, and under the dozen or so sister sites now being opened up around it across the Taz Tepler region, there is very likely more of this story still buried, sealed the same deliberate way the first great rings were sealed, 11,500 years ago, in no particular hurry to be found. We don't know exactly what it will say when it finally is. But so far, everything this hill has been asked to give up has turned out to say more than anyone expected, and it does not seem, yet, to be finished.